We're looking at the urinary system. The organs of the urinary system include the kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. You have two kidneys which connect to the urinary bladder via two ureters and a urethra. So each kidney is connected to the urinary bladder by a muscular tube called a ureter, and then the urinary bladder is able to drain urine from it via a singular urethra. So your two kidneys perform almost all the functions except for actual excretion for the urinary system. That is because they contain nephrons. Nephrons can be called the structural and functional unit of the kidneys. They are the filters in the kidneys, and there's tons of them in the renal cortex of the kidneys. The two ureters convey urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder, so again, connect those two organs, and the urinary bladder is a temporary holding tank for urine until it's excreted. The urethra is able to convey urine from the bladder to the outside of the body, and again, you have one urethra, one urinary bladder, two ureters, and two kidneys. The functions of the urinary system include the regulation of water volume, ion concentration, and pH levels. That's because the nephrons of the kidneys are able to filter out nitrogenous waste, toxins, ions, all of that stuff from the blood, and that way it can be excreted as urine out of the urethra. Then we have the ability to regulate volume and chemical composition of the blood by secreting things like water, salt, acids, and bases to the renal tubule system, which is part of the nephron. And this can change not only blood volume, but also its chemical composition or disrupt or change pH. We can also influence red blood cell production and BP because the kidneys secrete renin and erythropoietin. Renin is a hormone that regulates blood pressure or kidney function because it has to do with the regulation of blood vessels and how much they're constricted. So vasoconstriction is a common byproduct of renin secretion because it's involved in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. Erythropoietin is abbreviated EPO. EPO can act on bone marrow and stimulate an increase in red blood cell production. Here we can see the surface anatomy of the kidney. The helix is on the concave side or medial surface, and that's where things would enter or exit the kidney. We can also see three structures in this image on the right that enter and exit at the helix. The renal artery in red, the renal vein in blue, and this tan structure is the ureter. Here we've removed the vasculature or the blood supply for the kidney, of which the kidney has a vast supply. So we'll go through that blood supply in a later slide. What we're seeing here are the three regions of the kidney. The outer renal cortex. So renal cortex is just this outer part. And the renal cortex sits under the renal capsule. Then we have this middle medulla. So renal medulla has these pyramids, it has renal columns, and then we have the renal pelvis. So the three parts of the internal structure of the kidney are the renal cortex, the renal medulla, and the renal pelvis. The renal cortex sits just under the renal capsule, so it is the most superficial. The renal medulla is in the middle and consists of the medullary pyramids, as well as collecting ducts that run through them, and the renal columns found between each renal pyramid. And then last but not least is the renal pelvis, which collects urine from the minor and major calyces, and then that urine drains from the renal pelvis into the ureter. The renal pelvis is continuous with the ureter, and urine will flow from the ureter to the urinary bladder. We'll quickly just talk about some external anatomy for the kidney. So its average size is about 12 by 6 by 3 centimeters, weighs about 150 grams or 5 ounces, may be easy to think about. But not only does it have three regions inside, it has three membranes that surround it. And these are mainly going to be protective, including the renal capsule, which is a fibrous barrier just outside the renal cortex, a fatty protective membrane called the adipose capsule, which is designed for stability, so to hold those kidneys in place, but also protect them because they're really close to that dorsal area in your abdominal pelvic cavity. So any hard hit to the back could really jostle them or damage them. And then there's the renal fascia, which is dense fibrous connective tissue that anchors to the abdominal pelvic and adrenals that are near the kidneys. So here we can see that protection for the kidneys. This is on the outside of the kidneys. Again, we're looking at external anatomy, and this is a simplification. So we're looking at three layers of connective tissue found outside the kidneys. The layer that is the closest to the renal cortex would be the renal capsule, which is then covered by a fatty layer called the adipose capsule, which is then covered by a renal fascia, which is fibrous connective tissue that helps hold these kidneys in the retroperitoneal space. So let's just review some of that again. We have a renal capsule on the outside of the kidney. It's a thin membrane, it's fibrous, it's adjacent to the cortex, which is one of the three general areas of the kidney. Then you had fat outside of that, and then you had a renal fascia, which is fibrous connective tissue to hold the kidneys in place against the abdominal cavity and against those adrenal glands. Again, those three general areas of the kidney, starting with the first that underlies the capsule, is the renal cortex, the renal medulla, and the renal pelvis. We know the renal pelvis is continuous with the ureter. We also know that in the renal medulla, we find renal columns and renal pyramids, and that we find nephrons, especially the renal corpuscles of the nephron. Those are located in the renal cortex. Other things we've mentioned thus far is that the striped appearance of the renal pyramids is because of collecting ducts that run through them. And we've mentioned that the minor and major calyces drain into the renal pelvis. So some of those structures are more or less familiar. The ones that are less familiar will be introduced more throughout this PowerPoint. We mentioned also that a nephron is the structural and functional unit of the kidney. Structurally, it's a system of tubes and a filtration membrane that are able to perform not only filtration, but also reabsorption and secretion from and to the blood. And then those renal pyramids contain another tubule system, which are able to drain filtrate from the nephron to the calyces. And what the calyces receive is officially urine, and that will drain into the pelvis, which then drains into the ureter. These are some basic structures, some names, some anatomy that we're going to start using. So first, let's just reintroduce a picture of the kidney. So what we're seeing over here is the cortex on the outside, just under this shiny capsule. So cortex outer layer that we can see once we dissect a kidney, so it's on the inside. What we would see on the outside is a capsule, renal capsule, where we see these pyramid or triangle shaped structures. This is the medulla, so we can see this area is considered the medulla, and we have the renal pyramids and renal columns in the medulla, and then we can see the renal pelvis. Now I'm also going to point out structures we were just talking about that we were giving names to. So we have, for example, the base of a renal pyramid here. Here's the apex of a renal pyramid. The apex of a renal pyramid is also called a renal papilla. I'll say that again, renal papilla. Renal papillas drain urine into a minor calyx. So all these structures that are found near the renal papillas, these are minor calyces. And when a bunch of minor calyces join together, they make a bigger funnel. This is a major calyce. Or you can say the singular would be major calyx. And then from the major calyces, urine would then drain into the renal pelvis, then the ureter. So for as far as we've established, let's just trace the flow of filtrate. Filtrate is what's in a nephron, and that eventually becomes urine. So the nephrons are located mainly in the cortex. There's a renal corpuscle and a tubule system, and from the tubule system of the nephron, filtrate then enters collecting ducts. Collecting ducts run through the pyramids. They run from base to renal papilla. So that filtrate is able to drain from the nephron all the way through the collecting duct to the renal papilla and then into a minor calyx. There's a bunch of minor calyces, which then drain into a major calyx or multiple major calyces. Then the major calyces drain into the renal pelvis, which drains into the ureter. Now, the way that we're getting filtrate made is we're filtering the blood. So we have renal arteries and veins, as well as many other arteries and veins that we see inside the kidney. It has a really complicated vasculature. But we'll start with the basics. There's a renal artery that brings blood into the kidney and a renal vein that drains blood out of the kidney. And we'll see those at the helix. So renal artery brings oxygenated blood to the kidney. Renal vein takes deoxygenated blood away. And that was just 2 of the 3 structures we see at the helix of the kidney. Again, for the renal cortex, medulla, and pelvis, you have a quick kind of abbreviation here of what you would find in those areas. But we're going to quickly move into that vasculature. Again, you have another quick array of those structures we looked at. Renal pyramids, base, apex, it's called a renal papilla. Renal columns between the pyramids. More on that papilla, more on the calyces. You need to know that the nephron is the structural and functional unit of the kidneys. And this is actually what is processing blood. It's processing that blood that's coming from the renal artery and then traveling through tons of arteries to get to these nephrons that are located in the cortex. And then we filter out what we can from that blood. So we're going to leave really big proteins. We're going to leave cells and things like that that can't fit through the filtration membrane. We're going to leave that in the blood. And what originally moves into the nephron is called filtrate. And it's mainly going to consist of small things like ions and stuff like that. Maybe sodium, maybe some potassium, other things. Nitrogenous waste, urea. There's tons of nephrons in each kidney, so roughly 1 million per kidney. And the nephron is made up of 2 parts. So we've mentioned the basic blood supply. We know there's blood coming into the kidney. There's blood leaving the kidney. We know that the nephron's going to filter stuff from the blood. So it's going to filter blood plasma. And some of that stuff that was in the blood plasma is going to end up in the nephron. When fluid ends up in the nephron, it's called filtrate. So now let's look at the anatomy for the nephron. So we're going to look at the renal corpuscle, which is part 1 for the nephron. And we're going to look at the renal tubules, which is part 2 for the nephron. And each of these structures have their own parts. So the nephron has 2 parts to its renal corpuscle. There's the glomerulus, which is a capillary bed, and it gets its name from looking like a ball of yarn. It really is a convoluted capillary bed, looks like a ball of yarn, hence it's called a glomerulus. So a glomerulus is a capillary bed, and it's one of the parts of the renal corpuscle. Then there's a capsule that surrounds this capillary bed, and it's called the glomerular capsule. You may also hear Bowman's capsule or nephron capsule. But the 2 parts for the renal corpuscle are the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule, or Bowman's capsule. So there's a blood supply and a surrounding capsule. They make up the renal corpuscle. And it's these 2 structures, the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule, that create the filtration membrane. Where they come together, that is the filtration membrane. And we're going to talk about all 3 parts for that filtration membrane. All right, so that's part 1 for the nephron. Part 2, the renal tubule system. And the renal tubule system has 3 parts. It has a proximal convoluted tubule, a loop of Henle or nephron loop, and a distal convoluted tubule. Now, the distal convoluted tubule is going to be further away from the renal corpuscle than the proximal convoluted tubule. So that's where we're getting the terms proximal and distal coming into play and why they're named such. Now, they're called convoluted tubules because they're very windy and bendy. So they don't have a straight structure, whereas the loop of Henle has a less convoluted structure, and it's going to have a part of the loop that goes down, a hairpin turn, and a part of the loop that goes up. So we can see here it has a descending and ascending limb. And then the renal tubule system of the nephron drains into collecting ducts. Now, collecting ducts, though, are not a part of the nephron. It's just what the filtrate that's in the nephron will move into next. So again, nephrons are primarily located in the cortex. So here's our capsule for the kidney. This light gray, that's our cortex. And you can see, especially if we're talking about the renal corpuscle, which is this area with a red blood vessel and a surrounding capsule, those are located in the cortex. Even most of the tubule system, so here's a convoluted part, that's located mostly in the cortex. So we could say that nephrons are predominantly located in the cortex, and there's only parts of them, like the loop, which are located in the medulla, this darker gray. Collecting ducts are almost entirely located in the medulla, and again, they're going to go through those medullary pyramids, and that's what gives those pyramids a striped appearance, are these thick collecting ducts. So again, the nephron is made up of a renal corpuscle and a renal tubule system. Those are two parts which each have their own parts. The two parts for the renal corpuscle are the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule. The three parts for the renal tubule system are the PCT, nephron loop or loop of Henle, and the DCT. The nephron does not include the collecting ducts, but the fluid that moves into the renal corpuscle, then to the renal tubule system, is called filtrate. And that filtrate leaves the nephron and moves into the collecting ducts next. So that's why we want to mention them as adjacent to the nephron. Here's a better picture of a nephron. So that other picture is very small, but here we've blown up the picture of the nephron. So here is the renal corpuscle. There is an afferent and an efferent arteriole. So there's two arterioles in the blood supply for the kidney, which is unique. It's not something you normally see. And the afferent arteriole will bring blood into the glomerulus. So here we can see the glomerulus. It's a kind of ball of yarn looking blood capillary, but capillaries are still a network, so it makes sense that it's kind of round and kind of funny looking. There's a layer of this capsule that surrounds the glomerulus, and that capsule again is the glomerular capsule or Bowman's capsule, and where that layer of the capsule touches the glomerulus, that's the filtration membrane. And we'll see a better picture coming up, but the three parts of the filtration membrane are fenestrated capillary endothelium, a fused basement membrane, and then the foot podocytes of cells that make up the visceral layer of Bowman's capsule. So we have capillary endothelium, a fused basement membrane, and then the cells that touch the glomerulus but are actually of Bowman's capsule. Those are the three structures that make up the filtration membrane for the nephron. Again, glomerulus, Bowman's capsule, two structures of the renal corpuscle. And we find renal corpuscles solely in the cortex. Next, what we're looking at is this bendy or windy proximal convoluted tubule. And notice that the proximal tubule is close to the renal corpuscle, whereas our distal tubule is farther away. So there is a loop between the proximal and distal convoluted tubule. So once we filter blood and we have fluid enter the capsule, that fluid's called filtrate, and it'll move from the capsule into the proximal convoluted tubule. It'll wind through the proximal convoluted tubule, down the descending limb of the loop of Henle, then up the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, and then into the distal convoluted tubule. From the distal convoluted tubule, the filtrate will leave the nephron. So the nephron is here in purple, and it'll then enter into this yellow collecting duct. These collecting ducts run through the medulla of the kidney, specifically through the medullary pyramids, and they would empty this filtrate at the renal papilla. So a lot of collecting ducts would merge at the renal papilla. Filtrate would exit into the minor calyces that are surrounding or funnel-like around that papilla. And at that point, we would see that the filtrate becomes urine. So renal corpuscle is involved in filtration. I said we were going to talk about it more, so here it is. We can see that the glomerular capsule surrounds the glomerulus. We saw that in the last image. Here's a better image here. We can see there's an afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole is going to bring blood to the first capillary bed, which is the glomerulus. And then once we've filtered out what we need into the proximal convoluted tubule, we'll see that what remains in the blood is going to exit the glomerulus via the efferent arteriole. At this membrane, called the filtration membrane, there are three structures. There is the fused basement membrane between the capillary epithelium or endothelium, and then there are podocytes, or these cells of the capsule that have filtration slits. So those are the parts of the filtration membrane. So first we'll see that fluid enters the capsular space. when it enters the capsular space, it's called filtrate. The glomerulus, which is the first capillary bed, is being used to create that filtrate, and it's being fed by the afferent arteriole and then drained of blood by the efferent arteriole. So far our vascular supply that we've covered is we started with our basic renal artery and renal vein. Artery brings blood to the kidney, vein drains blood from the kidney, and now we're looking at really microscopic structures, and eventually we're going to put this all together in a pathway. So we have the afferent arteriole brings blood to the glomerulus, so blood enters the glomerulus. The efferent arteriole drains blood from the glomerulus, so this is the right order. Afferent arteriole to glomerulus to efferent arteriole for blood flow. After leaving via the efferent arteriole, the blood will then flow into either paratubular capillaries or a vasa recta. Now, both the paratubular capillaries and vasa recta are capillary beds, and there's two types of nephrons. There are cortical nephrons and juxtamedullary nephrons. Now, cortical nephrons have paratubular capillaries, juxtamedullary nephrons have a vasa recta. So just depending on which type of nephron is being used, you may see one or the other as the secondary capillary bed. But the microscopic vascular system for the nephron includes these structures: afferent arteriole, glomerulus, efferent arteriole, paratubular capillaries, or vasa recta. So you've probably noticed that the kidney vasculature is pretty unique. We haven't seen two capillary beds or two arterioles in any other tissue, and it's really not seen. So the fact that the kidneys have two capillary beds, which are the glomerulus and either the paratubular capillaries or the vasa recta, and that they have two arterioles, an afferent that brings blood to the glomerulus and an efferent that drains blood from the glomerulus, is really unique. So if you're asked about what is unique to the kidney vasculature meaning blood supply, this is what you want to list. The two capillary beds and the two arterioles are extremely unique. So let's look at this blood supply. We've established kind of two parts of it. We've established the blood flow into and out of the kidney at the helix, and even though we can't see it in this picture, we've established blood flow at the nephron. So nephrons are really small and they're in this cortex. But let's connect the two. Let's start at the renal artery and move all the way to the cortex and then back. So let's talk about how blood drains not only from the kidney, but gets to the nephron in the first place so that we have deoxygenated blood that's been used in order to create filtrate and then eventually be used to create urine. So again, let's start with our renal artery. So the renal artery is going to bring blood into the kidney, and then it separates or branches into the segmental arteries. The segmental arteries go up in between the renal pyramids, and so they're going to go between, and they're called interlobar arteries. That's where we get our next branches, the interlobar arteries, and they're between the pyramids. And actually, half a renal column and a renal pyramid is called a lobe, so that's where we're getting the name for these arteries. The interlobar arteries are then going to branch and arc around the base of the medullary pyramid, so it's called the arcuate artery. Then from the arcuate arteries, we get a branch that goes into the cortex. So these tiny little red lines, those are cortical radiate arteries. That's the name I like the most because it tells you that they radiate out into the cortex. But they're also known as interlobular arteries. So don't confuse that with interlobar arteries. Interlobular arteries or cortical radiate arteries are found in the cortex. Now, from the cortical radiate artery, we have another branch that produces the afferent arteriole. The afferent arteriole leads to the glomerulus. The glomerulus is drained by the efferent arteriole, and the efferent arteriole then drains into either the paratubular capillaries or vasa recta, depending on the type of nephron we're looking at. From the paratubular capillaries or vasa recta, we basically move out of the kidney the same way we went in. So we're going to move next into the interlobular vein, again in the cortex, or you can call it a cortical radiate vein. From the cortical radiate vein, we'll move into an arcuate vein, which is the blue that arcs over the base of a medullary pyramid. Then we'll move through an interlobar vein. And the only thing to remember is that there's no segmental veins. We go straight from an interlobar vein into the renal vein. We just go straight into the renal vein. So let's talk about that blood flow in a little more fluidly so we're not pointing out the structures. We go renal artery, segmental artery, interlobar artery, arcuate artery, interlobular artery or cortical radiate artery, afferent arterial, glomerular capillary, efferent arterial, paratubular capillaries or vasa recta, interlobular veins or cortical radiate veins, arcuate veins, interlobar veins, and then renal vein. There's no segmental veins, and the interlobular arteries and veins could also be called cortical radiate. So here's another picture showing you that pathway in just a little bit different way. So you can see blood flows into the renal artery, then into segmental arteries, then into interlobar arteries, then into arcuate arteries, then out into the cortex via the interlobular arteries. From the interlobular arteries, we're in the microscopic vasculature, so we can't see that, so we're going to blow it up. And we can see that from the interlobular or cortical radiate arteries, we have the afferent arterial branch off of that, which has blood flow into the glomerulus. From the glomerulus, blood flows into the efferent arterial. From the efferent arterial, blood will flow into the paratubular capillaries or vasa recta. And then from the paratubular capillaries or vasa recta, blood will then flow into the cortical radiate vein or interlobular vein. From the interlobular vein, blood will flow into the arcuate vein, and then it'll flow into an interlobar vein, which flows into the renal vein. So that is the blood flow through the kidneys. And if you're practicing this, if you're writing it out, which I do recommend, notice that except for the segmental arteries, all you're going to do is go in one way and then out the same way. You would just change artery to vein, and you would make sure that you include the two capillary beds, so the glomerulus and the vasa recta or paratubular capillaries, those are the two capillary beds, and then make sure you include the afferent and efferent arterial, the two arterioles. All right, next we're going to look at the three processes of urine formation, and we know one has to be filtration because we've talked about creating filtrate, and filtrate is the fluid that makes it into the tube. What we can see in this image is the renal corpuscle with its afferent efferent arteriole and the glomerulus surrounded by Bowman's capsule, or the glomerular capsule. We can see the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, both descending and ascending limbs, and we can see the distal convoluted tubule. So that's our nephron, and we can see how the nephron connects to a collecting duct. What we're also seeing here is some arrows. Now, the arrows that are pointing away from the tube, they are indicating a process called reabsorption. The arrows that are pointing towards the tube, they are indicating a process called secretion. Now, tubular reabsorption is when stuff leaves the renal tubule system and goes back into the blood. Tubular secretion is when stuff leaves the blood and goes directly into the renal tubule system. And before we get to reabsorption or secretion, filtration occurs. There has to be fluid in the tubule system to begin with, and that occurs by filtering the blood plasma found in the glomerulus. So glomerular filtration is just that. We're going to filter blood plasma in the glomerulus, and what fits through the filtration membrane, like ions and small stuff, will move from the glomerulus, which is a blood capillary, into the capsular space. That's going to be followed up by the functions of urine formation that occur in the renal tubule system, which are tubular reabsorption and tubular secretion. Be aware of the direction of flow that are associated with glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion. You want to know that fluid moves from the glomerulus to the capsular space during filtration, that fluid flows out of the tube and moves back into the blood during tubular reabsorption, and that we go from the blood to the tube during tubular secretion. So simple glomerular filtration is the filtration of substances from the glomerulus and then into the tubule system. And then tubular reabsorption is the selective reclamation process where nutrients are moved from the tubule system and back into the blood. So this occurs with the vasa recta and paratubular capillaries. We'll get stuff from that tubule system and put it back in the blood if it's needed, because simple glomerular filtration is not selective. Anything that fits through the membrane, through that filtration membrane, goes through the membrane. Well, your body wants some of that stuff back. It wants some of its salt. It wants some of that glucose. It may want potassium. It wants that stuff back. So it will reclaim some of that during tubular reabsorption. And maybe it reclaims too much sodium or too much potassium, or during the process of tubular reabsorption, we create more waste like urea from protein breakdown. And any waste that's still left over in the blood may be secreted at a later point in the renal tubule system, normally closer to the loop and the DCT, will be secreted back to the tube. So usually it's waste products or breakdown products of medicines, or maybe it's going to be secretion of water to the tube if you suddenly drink a lot of water, or hormones like ADH acted on the tube. So movement of waste and excess is what occurs during tubular secretion, and that is going to move from the blood back to the tube. So glomerular filtration is going to be the first step in making urine, and it's going to be the process that your kidneys use to filter excess fluid and waste products out of the blood and into the urine or collecting tubes of the kidney. So we need to eliminate that stuff from the body, but we'll kind of pre-treat it on its way through the tubule system. So we'll perform reabsorption and secretion as a result. We can also say that tubular reabsorption is the process that moves solutes and water out of the filtrate and back into your bloodstream. And it's known as reabsorption because it's the second time they have been absorbed. The first time was when they were absorbed into the bloodstream from the digestive tract after a meal. And then for tubular secretion, we'll say that it's the transfer of materials from the paratubular capillaries or vasa recta to the renal tubular lumen. And so it's the opposite. What you're seeing here is it's the opposite process of reabsorption. So usually, like I said before, only a few substances are secreted, and they're typically waste products. And urine's going to be the substances, or what urine is going to have in it is the substances left over, and they end up in the collecting duct. And they're going to be the products of reabsorption and secretion, what was in the tube after those processes. That's what becomes urine. So the nephrons, what we're seeing, are just molecular filters. They're filtering fluid out of the glomerulus into the capsular space. Once that fluid entered the capsular space, we are calling it filtrate. The filtrate travels through the entire renal tubule system. So it travels first into the proximal convoluted tubule, next into the nephron loop, and then to the distal convoluted tubule. That is the nephron, and from the nephron, we'll have that filtrate move into collecting ducts. And filtrate is what becomes urine, and it's essentially urine by the time that it leaves those collecting ducts at the renal papilla and enters into the minor calyces. Remember, the minor calyces drain into major calyces, which drain into the renal pelvis, which is continuous with the ureter. So things that the body wants are going to be reclaimed during that process of reabsorption, and things that the body doesn't want, like waste products or excess, those are going to be secreted to the renal tubule system. So the renal tubule system, again, are those parts of the tube, or that second part of the nephron that I listed before, and that was proximal convoluted tubule, nephron loop, and distal convoluted tubule. So we've talked about a lot of anatomy. We've mentioned a lot of terms. You've seen things like collecting duct, renal pyramid, major calyx, minor calyx. These terms should not be new at this point. What we really haven't done yet is trace the pathway of urine flow, urine formation and urine flow from the nephron all the way through to the urethra. So we haven't traced it all the way through the urinary system. So let's do that now. So we'll begin with the nephron, because filtrate is formed during glomerular filtration in the nephron. From the glomerulus, that fluid moves into the capsule, so we have it processed first in the renal corpuscle. From the renal corpuscle, that urine flows to the proximal convoluted tubule, then to the nephron loop, and then to the distal convoluted tubule. So from the nephron, urine would then enter into the collecting duct. And we know the collecting ducts give the medullary pyramids their striped appearance. And the collecting ducts run through the medullary pyramids from base to renal papilla. From the collecting duct, the urine will exit the papilla and then move into a minor calyx. A minor calyx is a funnel that drains the renal papilla, and they are going to create or join to create the major calyx. And that's a funnel that drains major calyces. That's a funnel that drains minor calyces, and it's going to be continuous with the renal pelvis, which is continuous with the ureter. And then the ureter connects the kidneys to the bladder, and the bladder is going to drain urine out of it via the urethra. So that was a quick overview. I make it even quicker. So urine is formed in the nephron, drains through its tubule system. It then drains into a collecting duct, which is found in the renal pyramids. The renal pyramids are going to empty that filtrate into a minor calyx first, then a major calyx. The major calyces are going to drain into a renal pelvis, which drains into the ureter, and the ureters drain to the bladder. Urine then leaves the body via a urethra, and that's going to drain urine to the external environment. So just make sure that you're aware of these structures that are used not only to create filtrate, but then to filter urine away from the kidneys and eventually out of the body. So we could simplify it by saying just the 9 steps in yellow, but we could also use all of this extra information that is next to those terms. We also want to take a closer look at the anatomy of the renal tubule system. You can say proximal convoluted tubule, or PCT, or distal convoluted tubule, or DCT. DCT and PCT are much easier as abbreviations, but for the purpose of this video lecture, I will say the whole term so you know which one I'm saying. They do sound a little similar if I say the abbreviations fast. And then you have the nephron loop. Nephron loop, pretty easy to remember. We're talking about the nephron, and it's a loop in the nephron. But remember, it's also known as the loop of Henle. So the proximal convoluted tubule drains a capsule. We know that the filtrate that ends up in Bowman's capsule drains first to the proximal convoluted tubule. And we also have talked about reabsorption. Well, what you may not know is that almost all tubular reabsorption of anything that's important that the body wants back, because that first glomerular filtration process is not selective, almost everything's going to be reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. Whereas the distal convoluted tubule is going to really function more in regulation. It's going to function a little bit in that tubular secretion. It can be acted on by hormones. It not only regulates things like sodium and potassium, but also acids and bases, so it can regulate pH. We see also that the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct are going to function in kind of the dilution of urine or movement of water. The collecting duct, along with parts of the nephron loop, especially are going to be responsible for either the reabsorption or secretion of water, and how that's going to modify the concentration of urine. And so one of the last things, if not least, is just a pathway of the nephron at work. And so this is putting everything together, talking about how blood first enters the kidney, how it gets from the kidney all the way to the nephron, which is microscopic and mainly located in the cortex, and then how we're not only going to filter out substances to create filtrate, but then we'll reabsorb some, secrete some back to the tube, and whatever products don't get reabsorbed back into the blood stay in the filtrate and become urine. We're also looking at the different options for the proximal convoluted tubule and distal convoluted tubule as of what they do or functionally. We're looking at the fact that the distal convoluted tubule is acted on by hormones. We're talking about the fact that minor calyces are going to receive urine before the major calyces. The pelvis is continuous with the calyces, and that the pelvis is going to lead to the ureter. So I highly recommend going through this PowerPoint as a study tool, but also watching this video lecture maybe once or twice. The vasculature and the nephron are probably the two most complicated parts. So just make sure you're aware of their parts first, then focus on their function. All right, and then all we have to finish up for this PowerPoint are the other structures for the urinary system. And so it makes sense that since the kidneys are going to handle most of the functions for the urinary system except for excretion, that we spent the most time on them. We won't spend as much time on structures like the ureters, urinary bladder, or the urethra. So here we're just going to look at the ureters. So superiorly, they're going to be continuous with the renal pelvis, so they're connected to the pelvis of the kidney. Inferiorly, they're going to pass through the abdominal cavity, so they're going all the way through the rest of the abdominal cavity. They're going to be generally behind the peritoneum, so they're mostly retroperitoneal, and they'll enter the bladder on its posterior. So depending on the individual, they can vary in length, but they're generally about 25 to 30 centimeters in length. If we were to take a cross-section, so we were to cross into the ureter in order to look at its mucosa, to look at its tunics, we would see that it does have an inner layer. It has a mucosa that's mainly going to be transitional epithelium. That's going to line the ureter. It has a middle muscular layer, so it can contract or perform peristalsis to a degree. And then it has an outer fibrous layer, which helps kind of hold it in place in this retroperitoneal space. So again, the mucosa or the epithelium of the mucosa for the ureter is transitional epithelium. Next, we're going to look at the urinary bladder. So the urinary bladder for a female sits in front of her uterus and also in front of her rectum. For a male, the urinary bladder is going to sit in front of the rectum and superior to the penis. We also want to look at the general structure, which is a middle layer of smooth muscle. There is also smooth muscle in the ureter, an outer layer of loose connective tissue, and an inner layer or mucosa lined with the transitional epithelium. So its tunics don't vary very much compared to the ureters. Their tunics are pretty much identical. Their structures differ, but their tunics are the same. The urethra, again, is going to be the most inferior portion of the urinary system. So it's going to extend from the base of the bladder to the outside world. We know that it's going to allow us to excrete urine out of the body. And there are anatomical differences in the urethra for males versus females. So females are going to have a much shorter urethra than males. We see the difference is about 4 to 14 centimeters. Actually, let me look at that real quick so we can see that. The urethra for women is very short in order for it to get from the bladder to the outside of the body. And there are actually 3 parts to the urethra for men. There is the prostatic urethra, there is the intramembranous urethra, and then the part of the urethra that runs through the penis is the spongy urethra. So it has 3 parts because it's much longer than the female urethra, but it's still the most inferior or last part of the urinary system. And then that's it for the urinary system. So make sure you go back and you look at the kidneys. We want to know that the kidneys have nephrons in them. That's going to be a great filter. It's going to be the structural and functional unit for the kidney. We had a really intense blood supply for the kidneys. Be familiar with that. You want to also know the 3 layers of tissue that surround the kidney, but also the 3 regions of the kidney if we're looking at its internal anatomy. Next, make sure you know the mucosa of the ureters and the urinary bladder, and know the general order of the urinary system organs, starting from the kidneys and working all the way through to the urethra. So if you have any questions, make sure you get in contact with your instructor, and that's it for the urinary system.